In 2018, a seemingly typical romance between two young people turned into an unimaginable horror that no one could have predicted. The unlikely couple were 28-year-old software engineer Jake Brendan from a close-knit family and 26-year-old aspiring writer Michelle Marsters. At first, their whirlwind relationship enthralled their friends and family, but as time passed, people closest to them started to suspect something wasn't right. Michelle's early years were a patchwork of emotional upheaval and instability. Michelle was raised by a single mother who battled drug addiction, and she spent her early years living in foster care and at relatives' houses. Deep psychological wounds from the frequent instability showed up as a frantic need for control in her relationships and a great dread of being abandoned. Michelle wrote a lot of journals as a teenager to express her anguish and longing. Writing gave her comfort. She was awarded a scholarship to a nearby community college because of her skill at telling vivid stories, and she thrived in the creative writing programs there. But her private life continued to be turbulent, characterized by a string of unstable relationships that consistently seemed to end in betrayal and heartache. Conversely, Jake Brendan was raised in a cozy and caring environment. Jake, the middle child of three, was brought up by parents who valued open communication and strong family ties. In the Brendan household, family meals took place every night, while weekends were devoted to board games or camping excursions. Jake's strong feeling of commitment to individuals he loved and his innate tendency toward compassion were encouraged by this loving atmosphere. Jake was exceptionally intelligent and excelled in school, winning a full scholarship to a prominent university to study computer technology. He was well liked by his peers because of his laid-back demeanor and sharp mind, and he kept a small group of pals from high school through college. It was at a neighborhood coffee shop when Michelle and Jake crossed paths. Jake knocked into Michelle's table by mistake, almost spilling her latte as she crouched over her laptop. Fearful, Jake insisted on buying her another drink. What began as a tense exchange turned into a lively discussion about books, technology, and their mutual passion for indie movies. Michelle was drawn to Jake's comfort and consistency, and she began to open up to him in a way she had never done before. In return, Jake found himself enthralled with Michelle's love of storytelling and her seeming fragility. That evening, they traded phone numbers, and a few weeks later, they were nearly inseparable. Their courtship was characterized by passionate gestures and exciting travels together in the early going. While Jake taught Michelle the fundamentals of coding and took her on hikes to his favorite picturesque locations, Michelle introduced Jake to the world of local poetry slams and art galleries. Their friends thought they were the ideal couple, with Michelle's creative energy well matched by Jake's cool demeanor. But their perfect romance began to show small signs of weakness as the honeymoon period wore out. Michelle started to express her uneasiness with Jake's tight relationships with his family and friends, as well as her need for continual reassurance. Gradually, what Jake had thought of as charming clinginess began to take on a darker aspect. After Michelle and Jake dated for more than 6 months, the initial exhilaration of being in a new relationship started to give way to a more complicated and unsettling dynamic. Michelle's long-simmering abandonment concerns and prior traumas began to show in increasingly troublesome ways. It began slowly at first. Throughout the day, Michelle would constantly text Jake, getting agitated and worried if he didn't answer right away. When they weren't together, she started to wonder where he was going and would frequently ask for pictures to prove where he was. At first, Jake thought this behavior was cute and tried his best to meet Michelle's needs, thinking it was because she loved him so much. But shortly, Michelle started making more and more demands on Jake's time and attention. When Jake made arrangements with his friends or family, she would get obviously agitated and would frequently guilt-trip him into canceling so they could spend time together. Michael, Jake's childhood best friend, was the first to express his worries. Michael questioned Jake about his growing absence from their social group at one of their rare men's nights out. Michael expressed concern about Jake, but Jake dismissed it, saying he was simply busy and everything was okay. "Jake, you've barely hung out with us in months. What's going on, man? Is everything okay with you and Michelle?" Michael said. However, a seed of disquiet had been sown deep below. He was plagued by a persistent sense that something wasn't quite right in their connection. Months passed, and Michelle's conduct grew more unpredictable and domineering. She started keeping an eye on Jake's social media profiles and probing him about every encounter with a woman, no matter how little. Often as he slept, she would go through his texts and insisted on knowing his phone password. Michelle was first well received by Jake's family, but as time went on, they began to worry about her impact on their brother and son. Jake's mother, Sarah Brendan, was especially worried. She observed that Jake had changed from being an outgoing and talkative son to being more reclusive and reticent. Tensions escalated during a family meal Michelle grudgingly attended when Sarah casually inquired about Jake's intentions to attend his cousin's impending wedding. Michelle spoke up before he could say anything. She continued, her voice sweetly sweet, but her eyes blazing with a warning. "We're actually thinking of taking a trip that weekend, aren't we, Jake?" To the obvious dismay of his family, Jake stammered through a non-committal response, caught off guard. Sarah pulled her son aside after supper, her voice urgent and low. Overhearing the conversation, Michelle became enraged on the way home. "Jake, honey, I'm worried about you. This isn't like you. Missing family events, barely calling." "Is everything all right with Michelle?" Michelle exclaimed. She misrepresented the facts to make herself appear as the victim, accusing Jake of letting his family stand in the way of their relationship. He was walking an increasingly perilous tightrope, torn between his love for Michelle and his deeply ingrained familial ties. "Your mother hates me, Jake. She's trying to poison you against me. Can't you see that?" In an attempt to maintain harmony with Michelle, he started to justify himself to his loved ones and friends, progressively removing himself from social events and family get-togethers. Jake's possessiveness and paranoia only grew as Michelle became the center of his virtually complete universe. She started to perceive dangers to their relationship in everyone and everything, including his co-workers, casual encounters with strangers, and most importantly, his family's efforts to stay in touch with him. Something inside of Jake started to rebel as Michelle's hold on his life grew stronger. The virtues established by his upbringing, the power of enduring friendships, and the significance of family began to resurface. Almost a year into their relationship, on a cool November evening, this internal struggle erupted. Jake's sister Lauren called to let him know that their father had been admitted to the hospital due to what appeared to be a heart attack. Jake reached for his keys without thinking, prepared to head straight to the hospital. But Michelle had different plans. "Jake, you really can't go," she begged. Torn between his fear of upsetting Michelle and his concern for his father, Jake sought to talk sense into her. "We were supposed to have dinner together. You promised." Michelle's expression twisted with fury. "Your family again," she spit out. For the first time, Jake saw through the deception. "They're always trying to take you away from me. If you leave now, don't bother coming back." Something inside him snapped at the ridiculousness of Michelle's demand in the face of a family disaster. He left Michelle screaming behind him and walked out the door without saying anything more. With his family's love and support around him at the hospital, Jake felt as though he was waking up from a long, disorienting dream. Thankfully, his father's illness proved to be less bad than first thought. Jake's mother subtly brought up the topic they had all been avoiding while he was waiting in the room. Jake, worn down from the previous night's events, at last let his guard down. He told his mother how much Michelle was trying to isolate him, how jealous she was, and how controlling she was. Sarah listened, happy that her son was at last realizing the truth, but yet heartbroken for him. Jake grew closer to his family during the next few days while his father healed. He realized how much he had missed the company of people he had neglected and made new connections with them. Jake ignored Michelle's constant calls and messages in order to give their relationship some thought. Jake was determined to break up with Michelle when he eventually made it back to the apartment they shared. But Michelle noticed that Jake was acting differently, so she attacked first. Michelle's comments grew into a tirade directed against Jake's family, especially his mother. "It's your mother, isn't it? She's turned you against me. I knew she hated me." Michelle's face twisted into a grimace of absolute loathing as Jake turned to leave, saying, "Jake, I can't do this anymore. I won't cut my family out of my life for you or anyone else." Though startled, Jake walked out unaware of the terrifying prophecy Michelle had uttered before leaving. The people of Queenstown would always remember what happened on March 15th, 2019. It started out like any other Friday, with folks rushing to get to work, kids getting on school buses, and the typical small-town routine in full swing. It began for Sarah Brendan as any other day, with her usual round of errands and responsibilities. After her morning yoga class, Sarah had just arrived home, her thoughts already focused on the upcoming weekend Jakey had pledged it to. Sunday was the first family supper in months, and Sarah was determined to make it memorable. She saw an unknown car parked across the street as she came into her driveway, but she didn't give it any attention. Sarah hummed gently as she opened her front door and entered with a load of groceries in her arms. She was blind to the shadow that softly followed her inside after unplugging from the house's side. Michelle Marsters had been waiting for hours, her eyes wild with a frantic gleam. She had deluded herself into believing that Sarah was the cause of all her issues. "Take Sarah away, and I'd have Jake all to myself," she reasoned. Michelle struck Sarah as she leaned to place her bags on the kitchen counter. She pulled a heavy cast-iron skillet from Sarah's own kitchen and slammed it upon the woman's skull, letting out a guttural howl of wrath. Trampled to the ground, Sarah looked confused and bewildered. Blood trickled from a cut on her head. Michelle continued unabated, engulfed in her mania. With each stroke, Sarah's meager attempts at self-defense grew weaker as she repeatedly brought down the skillet. After it was ended, blood splattered Michelle's face and clothes as she stood panting over Sarah's lifeless body. Michelle had done what had to be done in her deranged mind. The danger to her connection with Jake was no longer present. He would be forced to turn to her now, she thought, for solace and encouragement. Michelle went about setting up the scene with a clinical detachment that would later unsettle even the most seasoned investigators. She staged the appearance of a botched heist by strewing furniture around and emptying drawers. She took Sarah's money and jewels and pocketed it, thinking she would get rid of it later. Michelle cleaned the blood off her skin in the bathroom and changed into fresh clothing she had brought. She put the pan and her soiled clothes in a garbage bag and planned to throw them away from the spot. In a horrific twist that would later send shivers down the spines of everyone involved in the investigation, Michelle sent Jake a text as a last-minute gift using Sarah's phone saying, "Looking forward to Sunday dinner, sweetheart. Love you." Michelle left the Brendan residence as quietly as she had arrived, sure that she had hidden her trail. She would have appeared to onlookers as any other young lady going about her day, rather than as someone who had just carried out a vicious murder. Michelle burned her bloodied garments and threw the skillet into a deep pond after driving to a secluded location outside of town. Michelle went back to her apartment and started to prepare her alibi. She was talking to a friend over the phone about her plans for the weekend. She was cautious while posting on social media to create a timeline that showed her being away from the Brendan residence at the time of the murder. She waited after that. After several hours, just as the sun was setting, Michelle's phone rang. It was Jake, emotion exploding in his voice. "Michelle," he cried, "something terrible has happened. It's my mom. She's dead." Michelle gave an Oscar-caliber performance. Her voice was laced with phony sympathy and concern as she gasped in disbelief. "Oh my God, Jake, what happened? Are you okay? Where are you? I'm coming right over." Everything was proceeding as expected. She believed that soon Jake would be completely reliant on her. The tranquil community was rocked by the discovery of Sarah Brendan's body. When his mother didn't return his calls regarding Sunday dinner, Jake became concerned and drove to her house to see how she was doing. He would be haunted by the scene that met his eyes for years to come. Leading the investigation was Police Department veteran detective Lisa Martinez. Something about the scene unsettled her from the moment she entered the Brendan residence. Even though it seemed like a heist gone bad, a few details bothered her gut feeling. Yes, the house had been looted, but not in the frantic way that befits a scared burglar, but rather in a way that seemed almost calculated. Expensive equipment remained undamaged, but money and jewelry vanished. Interestingly, there were no indications of unauthorized entrance. While the forensics team searched the residence, Detective Martinez started the traumatic task of questioning the family. Still in disbelief, Jake was having trouble putting cohesive phrases together. After being discharged from the hospital, his father was distraught and perplexed. Lauren, Jake's sister, was the one who originally gave the clue that would eventually lead to Michelle. "Detective," Lauren replied, "I don't know if this is important, but Jake's girlfriend, Michelle, she's been acting really strange lately. She seemed obsessed with Jake, always trying to keep him away from us." Martinez became intrigued. When she gently pressed for more details, Lauren revealed that Jake had gradually become more alone, that there had been conflict between Michelle and his mother, and that there had recently been a fight that had resulted in Jake spending more time with his family. The investigators' doubts intensified. Michelle started painting a picture of herself as a controlling, neurotic partner who had tried repeatedly to cut Jake off from his support system when she spoke with his friends and co-workers. Suspicion, though, was not proof, and Martinez was aware that she required concrete proof. Next, forensics made a breakthrough. Traces of blood were discovered in locations that did not match where Sarah's body was located, even though the murderer made an attempt to clean up the scene. Later, DNA testing would verify that it was a combination of Sarah's and the murderer's blood. Furthermore, the fibers on Sarah's outfit didn't correspond with anything in her house. Martinez's team started the laborious task of examining traffic cameras and speaking with nearby residents. One old woman thought she could have seen Michelle's car parked on the street the morning of the murder, but she wasn't positive. Michelle was questioned by Martinez while the investigation went on. When Michelle arrived at the station, she put on a brave face of cooperation and concern, but the detective's skilled eye saw the small trembling in her hands and the sporadic darting of her eyes, which were subtle symptoms of nervousness. Michelle's response was polished and well-prepared. "Michelle," Martinez said in a casual tone, "can you tell me where you were on the morning of March 15th? She said she was working on her most recent writing assignment at a nearby cafe. She even showed me the receipt as evidence. However, there was something wrong with her account. Martinez chose to assume a chance. "Michelle," she stated, leaning forward, "we have a witness who saw your car near the Brendan home on the morning of the murder. Want to revise your statement?" For a brief minute, Michelle lost her calm. There was a glint of worry in her eyes and a slight hiccup in her breathing. She bounced back fast and denied the accusation wholeheartedly. However, Martinez had had enough. Martinez believed they were headed in the right direction, but the inquiry was far from finished. She had no idea that the case was going to blow up in her face because of an unexpected source: Jake himself. Following his mother's murder, Jake Brendan was overcome with grief and confusion for several days. Michelle was always there to console and encourage. Jake started to detect discrepancies in Michelle's conduct, which bothered him as the first shock subsided. It was a minor detail that initially made him suspicious. In searching for his mother's picture for the memorial service, Jake found into Michelle's journal. He should have respected her privacy, but something was bugging him to open it. He was deeply chilled by what he discovered. His mother was the subject of furious and more psychotic ranting on page after page. "I'm the only one who truly loves him. Sarah's trying to turn him against me. She has to be stopped." The final entry, made the day before the murder, said nothing more than, "Tomorrow I'll fix everything." He wanted to brush the thought aside, but too many things were fitting together. Michelle's delusional actions, her contempt for his mother, her demand to be by his side non-stop since the murder. Jake made the decision to tell Detective Martinez because he was torn between his growing suspicions and his commitment to Michelle. His hands trembling, he carried the journal to the police station and turned it over. "I think Michelle might have had something to do with my mom's death," he stated. Martinez's group got a warrant for Michelle and Jake's apartment search expeditiously. they discovered Sarah's lost jewelry in a sack stashed behind a closet. Fortuitously, the blood-stained skillet was visible because the pond where Michelle had disposed of the murder weapon had been partially drained for maintenance. Michelle's carefully built facade started to come apart as the evidence grew. Her alibi was exposed when it was discovered that the cafe receipt she had presented was for a different day, and surveillance footage from the morning of the murder showed her car driving out of town toward the Brendan residence. Jake consented to assist the authorities, while struggling with the treachery and the awful knowledge of what Michelle had done. He questioned Michelle about his suspicions over a taped phone conversation. Michelle's answers, taken by surprise, were damning. Michelle said, "Why did you do it, Michelle? I loved you." Her delusional response was terrifying. Her voice was uncannily calm as she said, "I did it for us, Jake. Your mother was trying to keep us apart. Now we can be together forever, don't you see? It was the only way." Using this last bit of information, Detective Martinez proceeded to make an arrest. Even Martinez could not have imagined the extraordinary turn of events that would occur as they sought to take Michelle into custody, but the stage was set for her arrest. Michelle was inside a bookstore, not realizing that everything in her world was about to fall apart. In order to reduce the possibility that Michelle would act frantically, Martinez had chosen to make the arrest public. Michelle was approached casually by two plainclothes officers as she was leaving the business. "Michelle Marsters," one of them began, "we need you to come with us for a moment." Michelle froze, her eyes flashing like an animal that had been cornered. Then she turned and fled in a fit of panic. Martinez just managed to push her down after a few steps. Michelle started to scream as the detective tied her. "You don't understand. I did it for love. Jake needs me." Martinez was waiting for Michelle in an interrogation room at the police station. Michelle continued to insist on her innocence for hours, weaving a more complex tale to try to hide the evidence. Martinez observed with patience, biding her time to get beyond Michelle's barriers. Martinez finally pulled out her trump card as tiredness and the weight of her lies started to catch up with her. She set Michelle's journal down in front of her. "Jake found your journal. He knows what you did." It had an instantaneous effect. Michelle's cheeks began to run with tears as her face collapsed. Shouting, "He wasn't supposed to find out," she said. "It was supposed to be our fresh start." A shocking confession that left even the most seasoned detective stunned came next. Michelle's voice was cold as she narrated the vicious attack, going into graphic detail about how she had planned and executed Sarah's murder. "I had no choice but to do it," Michelle affirmed, her eyes blazing. "Sarah was poisoning Jake against me. She never understood our love. With her gone, Jake would need me. We would be together forever." Michelle appeared to falter after making her confession, as if the truth of her circumstances had finally dawned on her. "What's going to happen to me?" she questioned, her voice suddenly fearful and youthful. The prosecution made a meticulous, convincing case. She took the jury through all of the evidence, including Michelle's own recorded confession, the murder weapon that was recovered from the pond, the DNA that was discovered at the crime scene, and the incriminating diary entries. Jake's testimony was arguably the strongest part of the prosecution's case. His heartbreaking statement described his creeping isolation and his mounting disquiet over Michelle's actions. With the overwhelming weight of the evidence, the defense was up against it. Stevenson chose to use a mental health defense, claiming that Michelle was unable to discriminate between good and wrong due to her traumatic upbringing and psychiatric problems. Psychiatrists spoke up and gave differing assessments on Michelle's mental health. In her defense testimony, Dr. Samantha Wright identified Michelle as having borderline personality disorder and stated that Michelle's murderous act was motivated by her intense dread of being abandoned. Michelle sat at the defense table throughout the duration of the trial, frequently giving the impression that she was not involved. Following a trial that lasted a week, the jury retired to deliberate. After only 6 hours, they returned with a guilty conviction of first-degree murder. Michelle eventually lost her unsettling composure as the verdict was announced, breaking down in tears. Michelle Marsters withdrew into a dream world while incarcerated after receiving a life sentence without the possibility of release. Unable or unwilling to accept the truth of her crimes, she kept writing, cramming notebooks with tales of tragic romances and star-crossed lovers. The episode served as a frightening reminder to Queenstown locals that danger can occasionally lurk in the most unexpected places. For many years to come, the tragedy would be regarded as a warning about the perils of unbridled passion and the dark side of love.